first project that I want to share the results of with you is a Water Research Commission project that was funded for 4 years, which is quite unusual of the WRC. They usually fund 3-year projects, but we were very fortunate to receive a 4-year budget for this remote sensing project. As you may know, remote sensing often takes a lot of field work for the validation of any information that we're trying to relate to the satellites. And often it takes up a year, actually, sometimes, just to do the field work for a project. So the focus of this WRC project was on both the lacustrine and balustrine wetlands under climate change in the grassland biome of South Africa. And I have to acknowledge my project partners, Lavenne, Moses, Ridwana, Anton, Nancy, Erwin, and Kate, who all have contributed to this report. So the report has been released in July this year, and you can download it from the website. It's quite a lengthy report. I'm still trying to work on making my thing shorter, I'm sorry. But there is also a policy brief that should be related to the project and also on it, which is just 1 or 2 pages and would summarize the content of it, so that if you are interested in the findings, you can dig directly into a relevant chapter and you really don't have to read my reports in full. And also these presentations help you just to see the main results. So the arguments that we had with why do we need to improve the remote sensing of our wetlands is because our initial findings showed that only 11% of our known wetlands mapped in Wetland Map 5 is open water or lacustrine systems. And as you know, many of the remote sensing products that have been generated both nationally and globally actually monitor only our open water systems. Our results show that 55% of our wetlands are in fact vegetated, and that the reflectance of these systems are very similar to the terrestrial or upland grasslands, which makes it difficult to separate them when you use traditional satellite images. And when I say traditional, I mean satellite images at both an airplane and spaceborne level, which used 4 traditional bands. Those are the red, green, and blue infrared band. Now, we often use these to actually digitize them because our eyes are trained to be able to do heads-up digitizing and interpret the complexity of what we see from the reflectance of these systems. But the moment you try to automate this at a landscape to national scale, it's insufficient. You would not be able to detect and separate the wetland vegetation from the upland systems. So it makes it very difficult for us to actually then automate something in remote sensing that could detect and monitor this over time. Also from the results, the remaining systems are 34% of what we actually just called or termed at the moment as arid. It's not a finalized term, but it's a term that reflects systems that doesn't have open water or vegetation for large parts of the year, or even over the larger hydrological cycle of inundation between the flooding of these systems. And then on the top left, the argument was also that we need to focus more on the grassland systems because this covers at least 1/5 of the country's surface area. And you all know that the grasslands are pretty much under threat, and a lot of development pressure is taking place in these areas, and we haven't mapped our palustrine wetlands in the grasslands properly, and not in the savanna either. And therefore, there was a great focus in the study to try and see if we can better map the palustrine wetlands of the grassland biome better with the newer sensors that is available at a spaceborne level. So these newer sensors that I refer to is not only the Sentinel sensor, but there's others as well, such as Rapid Eye, Worldview. And these sensors are new because they start including other bands from the electromagnetic spectrum other than the 4 traditional bands, the red, green, blue, and near-infrared bands. So for example, the Sentinel sensor has 13, or the Sentinel optical sensor has 13 bands at different spectral resolutions and spatial resolutions, but it's freely available to us, whereas very often government or a consortium of the government had to arrange for the purchasing of spot images, the 4-band spot images previously, and in between we managed to get the color ortho photographs from NGI that supplemented these intervals. So the argument is, if we can actually prove that the new freely available Sentinel spaceborne images from the European Space Agency can be used to monitor and detect some of our wetlands, then we're moving away from the limitations of the 4-band purchased satellite images. The advantage of these new images, as I mentioned, also have a red edge band, which is highly correlated to a number of attributes of vegetation. So biomass and species separability is enhanced by the inclusion of the red edge band on these newer sensors. Now, another one of these new sensors which include bands in the red edge region of the electromagnetic spectrum is the worldview sensor. But it's an extremely expensive satellite to purchase. You're looking at a very small image, probably the size of 60 square kilometers, would range up to 100,000 Rand. So that spatial resolution is below 1 meters, and it's able to detect the objects that we would like to see much better, but we can't afford paying so much to do monitoring. So the questions were framed around the capabilities of the Sentinel-1, which is a radar sensor, and Sentinel-2, which is the optical sensor, which are completely freely available. And our objectives were then to see, can we map and monitor wetland vegetation communities with these sensors? Can we quantify the above ground biomass within the wetlands? Can we estimate the variation in soil moisture content and potentially identify a threshold for separating wetlands and uplands from one another in the palestrine versus grassland upland systems? And can the hydroperiod of lacustrine systems be mapped and monitored with the Sentinel sensors? We used 2 study areas in the grassland biome, and you can see they're more or less on the edges of the grassland biome. That is the Hogsback in the eastern, the Vredenpan in the Mpumalanga province. And looking at the land cover data that you see for the Hogsback, it's the image on the bottom left, you see there's a dark polygon that, just next to the clip plot label, and that is assumed to be thicket and dense bush according to the land cover. However, if you visit the area, it's actually Phragmites. And therefore, we can see that from the current land cover products that used to be generated from Landsat was insufficient to actually identify wetland vegetation from the uplands. On the right-hand side, you see the land cover of the Vredenpan area, and similarly, you see that the Vredenpan, which looks like a little nostril from a dinosaur's head, is actually covered by Phragmites as well. But in this case, it's being picked up as being grasslands. And again, the rest of the study area, where the blue outlines show you the wetlands, are only being picked up as terrestrial grasslands. So one of the first steps that we did, we had Anton working with us for the Vredenpan and Nancy Job working in Hogsback with us. We used the worldview imagery that we've purchased for the 2 sites just to do heads-up digitizing following 2 fieldwork visits for each site that we've done. And you'll see the percentage written there at the top right or in each of the figures show you the extent of the wetlands that had been mapped before and after the improvement. So for Hogsback, only 2.5% of the extent of the study area used to be identified as wetlands, but following the completion, we now have 15% of the study area that are identified as wetlands. And for Vredenpan, the improvement was from 11 to 43% of the extent. So this makes a huge difference just to focus on the study area and get good satellite images, spend time and have a budget to improve this area. It's not easy just to improve this from just heads-up digitizing or desktop level. For the separation study, where we assessed the ability of the sensors to discern between different wetland vegetation communities, we went out the first year to assess what patches of wetland vegetation would be discernible or detectable from the satellite images. So this is a very different approach from doing your floristic assessment in a wetland. This is quite important to say what is the minimum area that any satellite image would be able to detect. And we have a principle that we use in remote sensing that you need at least a single pixel with surrounding pixels to be able to detect the inner pixel with higher accuracy. So if you have a 2 by 2 meter spatial resolution for one of the world view images, it means that your patch size that you want to detect needs to be 6 by 6 meters at least. And when you work with Sentinel, which has a 10 meter spatial resolution for some of the bands, it means that the size needs to be 30 by 30 meters as a minimum to have a pure pixel in the middle. It means that we have a completely different view of how we see the landscape. And therefore, we were trying to see if we can find homogeneous patches that's either discernible at a 6 by 6 or 30 by 30 meters pixel. So if you look at the wet grass, sedge and grass sedge communities of Tevredenpan, of which the photographs were supplied by Anton, it's very difficult for us to see with the eye that there's actually a difference between these. However, since we have so many bands with the Sentinel sensors, the optical one, number 2, that is across the electromagnetic spectrum where we don't have the ability to see with our eyes, it makes it capable to actually separate these communities from one another. So at Hogsback, we managed to identify 5 palestrine wetland vegetation groups that we can discern and have large enough patch sizes for the satellite image to be able to detect. And these were the Corex, Ficinia, Murxmorella, Phragmites, and sedge dominant systems. And just to pause for a moment on why we grouped it to sedge dominant, it's because it varied so much. We didn't manage to find one homogeneous type of dominance of a single species or even a genus that we could relate to all the different patches. So this already complicates things for us. Similarly, we've just grouped the upland species all together. They're also varied in their presentation and dominance within these patches. But otherwise, we managed to get land cover classes, 1 lacustrine and 6 others that would have been easy to separate from the upland and wetland communities. For the Tevredenpan, we had a few more. So we had 8 palestrine classes that we were trying to separate from one another. These included Aristida, Arundinella, Corex, a grass sedge community, Juncus, Phragmites, sedge dominant, and wet grass. And just again from the pictures below, you can see that the grass sedge dominant and wetland grass communities would very likely have similar spectral reflectances, which would make it difficult to separate from one another. And then again, we had 3 other land cover classes and a lacustrine class that we were trying to map with the satellite images. The results of the comparison, firstly at the top, we just evaluated whether we can separate palestrine, lacustrine, and other land covers from the upland systems. And you can see the number of sample points that we've used for each of these. For Hogsback Sentinel 2 sensor, versus the WorldView 3 sensor, and again the same for Tevredenpan in that top row. Then the overall accuracy is presented here, and these are using a different number of combinations, which is shown on the left. So we evaluate what is the overall accuracy that we would get if we use the bands only, or if we combine the bands and elevation of the study area, bands and several indices, bands on the above ground biomass, or combination of the bands, elevation, and indices, or all 4 of these combinations. And I've highlighted in yellow the highest overall accuracy that was achieved for each of the sensors and study area. Now looking at Hogsback, you can see we've achieved a high overall accuracy for Sentinel, it was 82%, and Worldview, it was 85%, so a difference of only 3% in the overall accuracy. And then for Tevredenpan, the results was 81%, and interestingly, the Worldview was lower at 77%, but again, a minor difference of only 4%. So these results show to us that there's a high likelihood that we would be able to use Sentinel optical data for monitoring and detection of palestrine wetland vegetation communities or grouping of these communities at a landscape scale. But again, none of the communities were really comparable. They were all different across the study area, and further work is therefore required to say, can we upscale these at one higher level to implement maybe a landscape monitoring system with the remote sensing images. So the report gives you all the details of the predicted map. We don't always just use the overall accuracy. We use it in combination with the user accuracies and the producer accuracies. And this is explained in the report. And we always see what is the highest user accuracy that we can attain for a single wetland vegetation group. And that map is considered to be better compared to another one that may have a higher overall accuracy, but a lower user accuracy for a particular group. So these are just the examples of how the maps come out when you group them to palestrine and wetland versus upland on the left, or to the specific wetland vegetation grouping on the right. And these are the results for Tevredenpan, again, grouping these at the top with the outline of the wetlands as mapped by me and Anton at a desktop level. You can see there are still differences and patches where one would either have to validate it or just say, are these good enough for our purposes of monitoring? So let's look at a comparison between the predicted results from the Sentinel and Worldview sensors compared to what we have mapped at a desktop level with heads-up digitizing. And overall, you can see that at least we managed to get more than 65% agreement between the expert interpretation and the satellite image. And the satellite images tend to slightly over-predict, and this is as a result of incorporating there are other communities that we not necessarily represent within the satellite image model, and therefore these are often then predicted by the satellite as either upland or wetland. So these details are also discussed in more detail in the report if you're interested in that. At the same time, we also sampled the above ground biomass for both study areas in the wetlands and in the uplands, and dried these samples and then measured the above ground biomass. At the top right, you can see that the values range here from about 400 to around 1,000 grams per square meter, which is very typical for the grassland, I'm told. And again, we did regression modeling and used a variety of scenarios that's shown on the left using the bands, reflectance, or backscatter from both the radar and the optical images, combined it with some of the indices, including both the NDVI and band ratios, and then combined both the bands and indices together. And again, comparing what is the coefficient of regression that we get for this different sensors. And here you can see, and also the satellite images, Sentinel 1, 2, and Worldview 3. So as expected, Worldview 3 did have the highest coefficient of determination of 0.63, but we were surprised that the optical Sentinel 2 managed to get into close range of this at 0.6 R square. And if you compare the errors generated, the standard error of prediction is only slightly higher at 42, I would say, compared to that of Worldview of 35. So again, this gives us enough reason to say that the Sentinel sensors are actually very good in monitoring the changes in the above ground biomass. And we know that the above ground biomass is an essential component of supplementing and recharging in a way the organic material in these systems, and in such a way sustaining, where relevant, the peat substrates of these systems. If you start burning these too often, too much over a season, then we're starting to lose that functionality of sequestering organic material and carbon. And then one of the students that was associated with the project, Redwana, she had a master's study in the Colbyn Wetland Nature Reserve, where she estimated the capabilities of the Sentinel sensors to predict soil moisture. She did her sampling on the 28th and 2nd of May 2018, and sampled within 1 hour before and 1 hour after of the satellites overpassing. So the Sentinel-1 radar sensor overpass around 6 o'clock in the morning and then after 6 o'clock at night, whereas the optical sensor Sentinel-2 passes around 10 o'clock in the morning. So it does reflect different states of soil moisture during the day, but this was really a first step to see, can we sample and predict? So can we predict soil moisture from these satellite images? And a little bit of background information, many of the soil moisture satellites, or the satellites that have been used previously to predict soil moisture, were at very coarse scales, literally with the spatial resolution being in kilometers, whereas our wetlands are way too narrow and small to have a spatial resolution of a sensor being in the kilometer ranges. And so for the first time, this European Space Agency satellites provide us with the opportunity to go down to the object sizes of our wetlands, which is between 10 and 20 meters spatial resolution, which is really ideal. And it was interesting, we conceptualized the idea of the study. We were at an international conference for remote sensors that was held here in Pretoria, and everybody laughed at us and said, you will never be able to actually predict soil moisture with the Sentinel sensors. But yet we thought we are compelled to actually test this and try it out and just prove it then. And so we did. We placed 10 sample points within the wetlands, 10 samples in the terrestrial areas, as shown in the map on the right-hand side, and then regressed the values that was recorded as percentage volumetric water count to the Sentinel-1 and to sensor images that was downloaded. On the left, you can see the rainfall patterns that was during this time. Many of you would think, well, this is the end of the hydrological period, and so how suitable is it to actually test it during this time? That year was, interestingly, a year in which the peak rainfall period was a little bit delayed, and we actually had still rain in at the end of March, which was a little bit unusual to receive very heavy storms then. And you can see that the samples was taken the one after a rainfall event, where you had that bit of a peak flood, and the other one just before. So I know that our results show, in a way, very limited sporadic soil moisture values during the time of the larger hydrological regime. But these findings are important enough for us to say we now need to monitor across the whole hydrological regime and the rainfall season to monitor these systems better and see what our results are. So the results of a number of scenarios that was evaluated, the highest and best performing models showed that the coefficient of determination was above 0.9 for both of the radar and optical sensors, with very low RMSE values. And this compares very well to international studies. And we also found that the soil moisture was actually significantly higher in the wetlands compared to the uplands. And a threshold of around 50% of the volumetric water count, if you measure this in the field, or 50% of soil moisture content, can potentially be further investigated for mapping the palustrine systems and separating these from the uplands. And these values of 50% are also suggested by a few other people from European countries as well. So it would be worthwhile, if you do have a volumetric water count or soil moisture meter and you are in the field and can write these up for us, it's valuable to South Africa's learning about what our thresholds are across different systems. So lastly, as part of the WRC project, we also looked at whether we can use some of these new satellite Sentinel sensors for monitoring the hydrological regime. And we first submitted this paper in January, and it was unfortunately rejected because they didn't like us using the Sentinel-2 optical sensor, and they said we have to work in the results of a Sentinel-1, the radar data. So we're working on this paper for submission, and including both Landsat and Sentinel-1. But for now, you can still read the initial results in the report, which shows that you can see the variation in the minimum and maximum values of inundation for the depressions of the Mpumalanga Lake District. And this is literally monthly values that you now can get from the Sentinel-2 optical data. Sentinel-1 also have at least, so these are twin sensors, meaning there's 2 sensors for each of the optical and 2 for the radar sensor. And therefore they have a much more frequent overpass in South Africa compared to Landsat. So Landsat, you would get a pass within a month, but the moment there's cloud cover, you have no values or readings for that particular month. And therefore your frequency, your temporal frequency, is much lower compared to your Sentinel sensors. So hopefully we would be able to get this paper out, and this would give us the ability to start monitoring the hydrological regime of our systems much more accurately. So just lastly, on all the other topics, these are shorter slides with less information that I can share with you. The information related to the South African Inventory of Inland Aquatic Ecosystems that was used in the National Biodiversity Assessment of 2018 is available from the SAIIAE website. I give you here the view of the page. And on the right-hand side, you can see that some of the data sets are available for download. But we decided it's much more valuable to have these as a whole collection, because here you can only download some of the shapefiles and the geodatabase, whereas you need to go to another site to actually get the reports. And Adwa, I see you are on the list. Namtla, when I downloaded this geodatabase yesterday, it unzips to a text file that says Dankie Gert. So that still needs to be fixed. In addition, what we've included in the link here below, the Google Drive link that I've highlighted here with yellow, is also the metadata files and all the layer files that you can use to apply these to both the shape files and the layers that's within the geodatabase. If you cannot open any of these second section data sets that's bulleted, from aquaculture points to wastewater treatment works, these are not available as shape files. Now, most of the software, including QGIS, can actually read your geodatabase, the one that we have supplied. So you should be able to open these. But if you have any trouble, Adwa is the person to ask. She can help you then convert these to shape files for your reading in whichever software you use. Then another study that we've been working on, I've just been helping Elijah and Jackie from DWS to look at the reporting of the Sustainable Development Goal 6.6.1. They require the reporting of the total extent of open water and palestrine systems as one of the sub-indicators that they use for the complete reporting of the water ecosystems. So the little pie chart at the top right show you all the different sub-indicators that are being used for SDG 6.6. And you can see that the one includes the water quality. This is what Mike Silberbauer has then done. It's also reported under another SDG indicator, but Mike has extracted that. And then there's also, so the quantity is basically what we've done using National Wetland Maps 5. And then top right, the health state still needs to be included. And then bottom right, it shows this, oh, that was actually the one we worked on. But you can see it's an integration of these systems together that actually makes up the reporting of SDG 6.6. And the sub-indicators are then assessed from different data sources and needs to be integrated by the Department of Water and Sanitation, reported to Statistics South Africa, who then compile all the results for the SDGs and report that back to the United Nations. So it's a long and complicated process, and it's also the data and reporting is going to be used and considered for our natural capital accounting that's being compiled by SANBI, DWS, and Statistics South Africa. So here in this short little paper that I've compiled then and submitted, so it's currently in review, is a short communication or a research letter of a few words that explains what the challenges are for South Africa in terms of reporting to SDG 6.6.1, the extent of our wetlands. Firstly, if you click on this app, and you can all go and test it, you can click on South Africa and it would give you the overview of whether our systems have been increasing or decreasing in terms of open water and other systems in our reservoirs, and also for mangroves. What's also interesting is you can click on any one of these individual polygons and they would give you more detailed bar charts with time series data of these indicators. So go ahead and go and play with that. I've not included this in the short paper. What I did is just compare the available data sets that the SDG provides for the countries in terms of their total amount of wetlands. And here you can see it's just above 6,100 square kilometers. If we compare these to the other data sets that's available in South Africa, you can see the land cover has already mapped more than half of that. And Dr. DLR has included way more because they've included all the river systems. And we've incorporated data from both the NGI data and some of the land cover and others, and therefore end up with a total amount above 43,000 square kilometers. But let's unpack that first and see what does it consist of. So our National Wetland Map 5 consists of the lacustrine systems, nearly 3,000 square kilometers, palestrine, that's more than 14,000 square kilometers, rivers above 11,000 square kilometers, the arid systems, and then the artificial systems that I had to cut off here just to fit into the slide. So the comparison is quite more detailed compared to what is provided on the website for the SDG 661 indicator. But using our data, we're representing 87% more than what the SDG is reporting on. So that is a big concern. And what they're monitoring is predominantly open water systems and a little bit of the seasonal systems, because the remote sensing data can detect the open water systems better than palestrine systems. The data set that they use as input to, oh my word, I don't know what happened here at the top left, but in any case, apologies for that overlap. So the data set that they use for input to the international reporting is the data, the global surface water data from Pekel et al. 2016. And this is a paper that was published in Nature. So I've extracted one of these data sets. You can download, it's freely available. You can download the TIFF data and you can merge it for the country, or you can just use the area that you're interested in. And one of the data sets they have is the transition data, which I found very interesting because they categorize it according to different categories of the hydrological regime. Now, I used this to compare it for 2 study areas and at a national level. I'm presenting here the national statistics in the graph at the bottom, the table, but I'm also showing you how it looks like for Hakski and Pan on the left, where you can see only a few systems are reflected, which is called new seasonal. And on the right, the Mpumalanga Lakes District, where we have more than 300 open water and palestrine systems in the form of depressions. So you can go and compare these. The increases that they report is against a reference period, which is around, I think it was just before the 1990s, when we had a decadal drought between 1991 and 1995. So it's a realistic reference period that they use, but the increases and decreases that they do report still needs to be correlated with our natural cycles of climate variability. The other conclusion that I have to keep on moving this little box to see where I'm talking. So the other statistics, if you look in the red circles below, using the Pekel et al. Data, it confirms that we have very few open water systems compared to a lot of systems that are not predominantly inundated for most of the year. So these are, in fact, supporting the initial analysis that we've done, that 11% of our systems are open water and are, in fact, have water that we can monitor with different open water indices compared to the remaining systems that we actually need to develop and investigate new indices or new methods with remote sensing to monitor them. So we're currently also busy, a number of authors working together on a status assessment of the swamp forest. Berliner is somebody that did a national forest assessment in 2005 and 2009. He published his PhD on this, and he reports 30 square kilometers of swamp forest that are occurring in the country. More recently, Debbie Jewett from UK, Isambelu KZN Wildlife, did an assessment of the status of swamp forest in 2016. She published the results in 2018 and reported that 87 square kilometers of swamp forest were mapped then by Scott Shaw and Escott in 2011. And we don't have sufficient historic records of this extent, so we have to assume that this is the true extent of the swamp forest. They're also separated into 4 different types, according to the dominant canopy species that were observed. So this includes your Barringtonia, Ficus trichopoda, your Raphia, and Vocanga. And the assessment then for their threat status and protection level was done at that level and found that all 4 were critical endangered, and 3 of them were moderately protected. Just to backtrack a bit, both Berliner and Jewett, and I think Messina and Rutherford, puts a 100% conservation target on these systems. Jewett used a 10% biodiversity of a protection level target to evaluate the systems. Therefore, 10% of the total extent needs to be within a protected area to be considered well protected. However, so she found that the 3 systems, Barringtonia, Ficus trichopoda, and the Raphia, were moderately protected, but the Vocanga was not protected at all. But new data sets have become available that also have mapped swamp forest at a finer scale, not necessarily always typing these to specific dominant tree species, but the initial integration of these data sets show that we have, in fact, 120 square kilometers. So looking at the integration of these systems are still range-restricted systems that would actually be qualifying for the red listing according to the IUCN criteria. But NEMBA doesn't consider the coastal swamp forest actually as an ecosystem to be red listed. And literally, we therefore have a system or a habitat that falls through the cracks because it's not living up to the expectation of an ecosystem. And we therefore are developing strong ideas that because our National Wetland Map 5 is a poor representation overall of our wetlands, and we don't have a high confidence that it's actually representing all our systems. So by the time we do a thorough assessment of these ecosystem types for red listing in NEMBA, we may have lost many of them. And we're presenting an argument that we may have to consider a bottom-up approach in identifying these unique and range-restricted aquatic habitats and compile these for suggested red listing under NEMBA. So these are just some ideas that's coming out for this project. I've also supported Pieter Grundling and Althea, working also with Jason LaRue on mapping or extending on initial work that they have done for the NBA 2018. This was a appendix that they've written for looking at the burning peatlands and how often they occur, where do they occur, and whether they are increasing or not. So this is a new graph that we've generated for a journal paper that will probably be submitted in the next month, where we've actually mapped where these systems are burning, how long they are burning, and we've included as the brown columns the decadal droughts that was observed in South Africa. And just if you look broadly at this graph, it just shows you the increase in the number and frequency of peatlands burning in the Maputiland coastal plain as well as on the west coast. This is a concern that we have. It's not only from a decadal drought of 2015-16. You can see we had a much more intense and severe drought during 1991 to 1995, and yet fewer systems burned. So we have to question what is the effectiveness with which we are managing land uses in the catchment, and would they be resilient against climate change? Lastly, I thought maybe this forum would enjoy a few pointers to how you can start touching and exploring and playing with Sentinel data. Firstly, there's three options. The first option is free viewers of the data. So I've seen, I don't have ArcGIS Pro myself, but I've seen people able to access and view Sentinel-2 data in ArcGIS Pro, and it reflects your wetland extent much better than the NGI color author photographs, which sometimes have cloud cover and was sometimes taken in the dry season. So please have a look at this. Remember, Sentinel-2 has monthly overpass, more than. So the likelihood of you being able to get a recent image for your study area is going to be very high. Then alternatively, you can also go to the EOS Land Viewer. It's free, but you need to register. They offer you 10 free satellite images per day. And they also have something like 256 storage space. I'm not sure if they allow online processing. I don't use that, but you can go and explore it. The second option, this is the way that I use it. I'm a little bit traditional and still scared also of new methods or so. I use the Copernicus Open Access Hub. Here's the link, again, freely available. You have to register, but once you register and log in, you can download individual scenes. You can also compare which scenes have less cloud cover and which scenes actually doesn't have a cloud on top of your study area. You can then download it and view in whichever software you want. I use the free Sentinel software, which is called Snap. You can download it for free, install it for free, and do your pre-processing of your images there. I haven't explored much of the analysis capabilities of Snap. I often just use proprietary software such as Envy for doing the analysis. But please play with this in QGIS. Apparently QGIS is also amazing in being able to derive your NDVI, other indices, and so forth. And then the last one that I've only dipped a toe in yet, I haven't mastered this yet, is your Google Earth Engine and Amazon Web Services. To date, they haven't had actually pre-processed images. It means that you get a lot of interference from your upper atmosphere in these images, but if you're only using it for viewing, it's not too bad. The moment you get to regression and classification, you have to make sure that they're pre-processed and the atmospheric correction and terrain correction has been done. And that is a mouthful. I hope it's helpful to you all.